Take your pick on the name. The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, the Torso Killer. It's the same disturbing case that has mesmerized people in Northeast Ohio for 90 years. And to this day, some will tell you the case has never been solved. Most put the number of victims at 13. Others believe there were more, that there were actually more victims found out of state. This much is true. The Torso Killer was one of the most notorious serial killers in Cleveland's criminal history. And hunting him in the 1930s through a now extinct area of the city known as Kingsbury Run was Elliot Ness, who, as a federal prohibition agent, helped to take down the notorious Al Capone. Ness, at the time of the Torso murders, was Cleveland's safety director.
I think Elliot Ness was smart enough to realize quite early on that this was something that was beyond his experience.
Hi everyone, I'm Brian Duffy, and this is Dark Side of the Land. The man with the resonant voice who appears just as he sounds, mutton chop, sideburns and all, is Dr. James Badal, now in his 70s, sharp as a tack, and the author of 3 books alone on the Torso murders. Dr. Badal has done, as you'll clearly be able to note, exhaustive research on the case of the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. Now, your first question, especially if you're from Cleveland, may start with this. Kingsbury Run? What is that? Where is that? Well, in the 1930s, Kingsbury Run, according to the Case Western Reserve Encyclopedia of Cleveland History, was a natural watershed that ran from the area that is today Warrensville Heights and Maple Heights through the East 90th and Kinsman area, through East 55th and Broadway, and then northwest to the Flats. According to the Cleveland Planning Commission, except for its mouth, it is no longer a water feature in the city's environment. This was a desolate place. Awful, according to Dr. Badal, does not do Kingsbury Run justice. It was Depression area Cleveland, and we would consider the area now simply a massive homeless encampment, as what they called shanty towns popped up along Kingsbury Run. What was it like in Cleveland in the mid-30s during the Depression? It was not a pretty picture, this city. It's like many big industrial cities at the time.
Life was difficult. There were at least 6 different shanty towns in Kingsbury Run at various points during the 1930s. And the interesting thing about many of the residents is that they were not bums. They did have jobs, but they were low-paying jobs. They couldn't afford to live anywhere else.
These shanty towns, as they were rudely built. No electricity, no running water, just boards or whatever people could find to provide some kind of shelter. They were built one right next to the other. And while many of the people who were forced to live in these so-called shanty towns were working people, it was still a dangerous place. Desperate people just trying to survive one of the worst economic eras in the history of our country. And it became more so, much more so, when the dead bodies, decapitated, dismembered, started piling up in Kingsbury Run and around the city. It was gruesome, beyond brutal. The names, the Torso Killer, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, stuck quickly.
This is essentially because the first identified and recognized torso victims were found in Kingsbury Run, and so was victim number 4. The others were found fairly close by, except for the parts that he dumped in the lake or the river. And the first victim, the Lady of the Lake, whom they discovered in September of 1934, was way east, beyond Bracknell.
Yeah. She's known as victim 0 now because they didn't put it together. I mean, they found her and didn't realize what they were dealing with until they saw all these other victims and kind of started putting it together. That's why she's victim 0?
Well, the first 2 recognized victims were killed a year later. And of course, they had no notion what a serial killer was in those days. This was one of the things that hampered the investigation terribly. They were operating on the assumption that people were killed by other people that they knew for understandable reasons like greed, anger, jealousy, something like that. And the notion that we might be dealing with someone who was killing people he didn't know for his own crazy reasons really never occurred to them until later. They did not make the connection between all of these victims until the summer of 1936.
It was stunning, beyond belief, unheard of. From September of 1935 until September of 1936, 6 more victims of the torso killer were found all around the city. Police, Dr. Badal said, believed that all of the victims were from Kingsbury Run. Kingsbury Run, as we mentioned, was already a place where life was difficult. And now we can imagine the fear was palpable, making it next to unbearable. People on the margins with low-paying jobs worried they would be the next victim of the Mad Butcher, that maybe they would have their head cut off. The victims were men and women. The details were gory, unsettling, to say the least. In some cases, it was a torso that was discovered. In some cases, some unsuspecting person walking through Kingsbury Run would stumble upon a head. Police would find the torso not far away, and then a set of legs or arms. All similar murders, but during that year, from September of 35 to September of 36, they never actually saw a pattern. They moved through this investigation for quite a while without the notion that they were dealing with a serial killer. They did not put it together for quite a while.
Now, I can't say for sure that they didn't think they might be dealing with one person. There were 2 different coroners during this period. Pierce, who was coroner for the first victims, and then, of course, the legendary Samuel Gerber, who came in, I think, November of 36. And he pointed out the similarity. Whoever was doing this knew what he was doing. He knew what the landmarks of the body were.
Samuel Gerber would go on to great fame. Dr. Gerber was the coroner during the infamous Dr. Sam Shepard case that captivated the city of Cleveland for years. Shepard, as you remember, was accused of murdering his wife Marilyn in their Bay Village home, and Dr. Gerber was adamant in his findings through multiple trials that Sam Shepard was guilty of that murder. During the torso murders, Dr. Gerber was new to the job, but the findings to him were exceptionally clear. Someone who knew his way around a body was murdering, decapitating people in Cleveland, and Gerber was sure, quite clear, that this was the work of one killer, a madman.
An interesting thing about this is that Gerber himself never performed an autopsy. I've got copies of all the original autopsy protocols, and a city pathologist performed them, and Gerber just simply signed off on the results.
So at this point in this investigation, it had become clear, at least to Dr. Gerber, that the victims were connected, the work of just one man. And due, most likely, to this fact, the city was in an absolute frenzy. The case had become front page, blaring headlines almost every single day. Cleveland police canvassed the city. Thousands of interviews were done, according to Dr. Badal. And while the story fascinated the people of Cleveland, there was fear. People were scared. There was good reason, too. Clevelanders could not help wondering when the Mad Butcher would strike again. But there was more to this. There was fear that was driven by the sheer violence involved. What was done to the bodies was brutal.
It was surgically,
before or after.
It was surgically precise. Interestingly enough, when it came to the male victims, he seemed to only cut off their heads, and in a couple of cases took off their genitals as well. The women he all cut up in smaller pieces.
I wonder what that means.
That's a good question. It may have had something to do with transport. Who knows?
Right. The bodies were surgically dismembered by the Mad Butcher, a brutal part of the killings that horrified people in the city. But for the most part, knowing how the victims died remained a mystery. Were the victims killed first and then decapitated and dismembered, or were the victims actually horrifically decapitated and dismembered while they were still alive? That mattered very much so to the investigation.
We don't know how they died. The only one who may have, in the cases in which they found the bodies soon enough to tell, and in some cases they didn't, the cause of death was decapitation, which is not to say that the victim was necessarily conscious when that happened. The man known as victim number 1, Edward Andrassy, had rope burns on his wrists, so he may have been, but there's no way to tell about the others.
Which brings us to the most significant roadblock to this investigation. The victims, most of them, were never identified. Victim number 1, as you heard Dr. Badal mention, was Edward Andrassy, but he was only one of 2 victims that were ever positively identified. And in the middle of an investigation, not knowing who your victims are puts you, as the investigators, at a major disadvantage. The problems with IDing the victims were clear and understandable. Now remember, this was the 1930s. In the middle of a depression, the victims were being plucked from what was basically a homeless encampment, people who were just trying to survive on the margins. Here's a case in point. Victim number 4, he was found in July of 1936 and found intact, except for a severed head. He was only estimated to be about 20 years old. He had 6 distinctive tattoos on various parts of his body. In those days, tattoos were not that common, but even as pictures of those tattoos were circulated around the city, the tattooed man, as he became to be known, was never identified. And this takes us to one of the most interesting aspects of the case. As it became more difficult to identify the victims, police decided to make plaster masks of the victims' heads, death masks, as they became to be known. And those masks are on display to this day at the Cleveland Police Historical Society and Museum. And so we're with Maisie Adams, who is the executive director of the Cleveland Police Historical Society and Museum. And we've got a wonderful opportunity for people who are interested in the torso murders to come to the museum and take a look, because the death masks are just extraordinary pieces of history. Maisie, why don't you kind of take me through this, why they decided to do this, and what they thought they could accomplish by doing this?
Sure. So the death masks are really the only pieces of evidence that are left from the investigation. And usually when the Cleveland police were creating masks, plaster masks, they were creating them to help identify victims of crimes, but also if they wanted to display something, if they were on the hunt for a criminal or something, they might do that. And in the torso murders, what they were doing was trying to identify the victims. Now the first 2 masks that were created, and they were created by the Criminal Bureau of Investigation. There was a Detective Lloyd Trunk who worked on these. And the first 2 were created for victims number 1 and number 2. Those 2 victims had already been identified using fingerprints.
The only 2
The only 2 were positively identified.
So why did they do masks of victims who were already identified?
I have to say, I am not sure why they did that. It may have been an attempt to do a second identification, another way to identify them, just not with fingerprints. It's unclear to me why they did that, but they did. And then we move along on victim number 4, who is called the tattooed man. They also created a mask for him. Now, victim number 4 was never identified, which is surprising given that the efforts that they went to try and find out who he was.
It's amazing he wasn't identified, because tattoos in the mid-30s were not a thing.
Very unusual.
And nobody knew who he was. And there's an interesting aspect that goes with the mask. They also did something that we wouldn't even think of it at this time.
Right. Before the mask was created, the coroner's office actually displayed his head, publicly to the public, and over 2,000 people visited the coroner's office in an attempt to identify him.
Okay, and it says the plaster cast of his head. The cast was at the Great Lakes Exposition.
Correct. So
thousands of people walked by.
Hundreds of thousands of people walked by. As displayed right next to the map of his tattoos. Hundreds of thousands of people mostly from Ohio, but all over the country, and not one person was able to identify him.
It's amazing that these folks, so many of them, only 2 of 13, were identified, and that shows you what that shanty town at Kingsbury Run was just for people.
Yes.
And Dr. Badal said, hey, listen, a lot of those people had jobs, but they just made no money during the Depression, and that's why they were
living on the margins. They were poor. Many people were coming and going, so maybe they weren't connected with their family. They were from out of town. It was a very transient community, so that's where
dangerous too, made more dangerous by this. And then so this was the 4th mask that was made. Take me through this one.
There was a 4th mask that was made for victim number 8. She was found underneath the bridge, and her remains, and they did make a mask of her. She was never officially identified, but later on there was a tentative identification using her dental work. And then her son, she was tentatively identified as Rose Wallace, and one of her relatives came back into town, and looking at the mask and the dental work, believed that it was his mother.
Right. Well, this is an amazing piece of history that so many people in our area still talk about. You must get, when people come in, they must be, I'm taken aback by what I'm looking at, the pictures. I don't know that we could put any of this stuff on TV.
It's very graphic.
It is very graphic. They called him the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, and when you look at these pictures, it's very clear why they called him the Mad Butcher.
And it's also clear from the earlier victims on that he was increasingly violent in what he was doing with the bodies and the number of pieces. Yeah, really disturbing, but also very popular.
Right. And what's your takeaway, Maisie, from the whole thing? I mean, this is, I don't know. I mean, serial killers in that day and age were just unheard of, quite honestly. I know that Dr. Badal believes that it was kind of the first effort of FBI profiling. This was a case that really changed a lot of things. There was the beginning of forensics that was done in this case. And then there's the whole Elliot Ness aspect to it that is just fascinating to so many people.
Yes, I think it really captures the imagination, thinking about how this went on for so long, the fact that it is technically unsolved, although we are all pretty certain we know who the killer was. One of the things that was interesting to me in developing this exhibit and researching is that there were, really 4 different investigations happening in parallel, but not always together.
Right. Until the mayor, Harold Burton, called Ness in and said,
right, but
listen,
then Ness did his own thing, and the police were doing their, what they do very well all the time. The coroner's office was doing their own work, and then the county did theirs, which was maybe the least effective and unfortunate, but all of these very smart, intelligent people working on this, and were never able to track down the killer at the time.
Officially, yeah. Well, Maisie, thank you. Amazing stuff. And I know that people here, my father was, he talked about this all the time, and I know that a lot of people in Northeast Ohio are really just enthralled by this. Thank you very much.
Sure, thank you.
So while a piece of history is available for all of us at the Police Historical Society, in the 30s, they certainly were not worried about how this would play out 90 years later. They had a killer to stop. But the fact that most of the victims remained unidentified complicated the investigation. significantly. An identification could have exposed a possible connection between the victims. Quite possibly, they lived in the same area of one of the shanty towns of Kingsbury Run. And identifications could have led to multiple avenues of opening up this investigation. But the lack of those IDs was then, and remains now, Dr. Badal believes, one of the great mysteries of the Torso murders.
Well, of course, if you operate on the assumption that people are murdered by other people that they know, the first step in the investigation is who is the victim. Then we look at his associates, we look at his family, and her or hers. And when they were only able to identify for sure 2 victims, and they were only able to identify them because they found their bodies fairly quickly and they had police records. So they had mugshots of them.
So there was a lot of things standing in the way of this investigation, including the time when it took place. It was just in the 1930s. So you believe they did a fairly decent job, or the best they could, in this investigation?
I would say yes, based on what I have read from the police reports. And I've read probably a couple thousand pages of them. They knew what they were doing according to the standards of the time, and they were not sloppy about it.
The bodies piled up, and that had city leaders on edge and had the public fearful and asking questions. But through all of that, the police investigation itself was turning into what was and has become, in a historical sense, fascinating in multiple ways. As Dr. Badal has mentioned, there were thousands of interviews done, but it seems as if the Cleveland Police Department had just thrown a wide net over the murders. The county was investigating. There did not seem to be a cohesive, planned, and well-executed investigation at that point that was underway. Maybe, just maybe, that changed in the summer of 1936 when Cleveland Mayor Harold Burton decided that his high-profile safety director, one Elliot Ness, needed to be much more involved in the case, and that subsequently led to detectives Peter Merlo and Martin Zalewski being put on this case. What are your thoughts about the work they did?
By the standards of the day, it was very thorough. I had access to all of Peter Merlo's surviving police reports. And he was very detailed. He was very specific about what he was doing. He was not put on the case full time until the summer of 36. And in a lot of cases, you look at what doesn't happen or what doesn't get said. But the summer of 36, the Republicans were meeting here. There was the Great Lakes Exposition, and the American Legion was meeting at the end of the summer. And I think what happened is that Mayor Burton then went to Elliot Ness, who was the safety director, and had been here since December of 35, and said, look, you've got to get more involved in this case. Then I think he went to the chief of police and said, get your best man on this. Because Merlo wrote about being contacted by the chief of police saying, you're on this case now full time, pick whoever you want to be your partner.
At this point, it may be a good idea to explain how Elliot Ness, the leader of Chicago's famous Untouchables, ended up as the safety director in the city of Cleveland. Ness's band of prohibition agents began investigating Al Capone in Chicago in late 1930. Capone had already been under investigation by the United States Bureau of Internal Revenue. But President Herbert Hoover wanted Capone taken down and believed that it had already taken too long for that to happen. So Ness and his agents, reportedly turning down multiple big money bribe attempts, began taking out the Capone organization by attacking his bootlegging operations. Elliot Ness had Capone on the prohibition charges, but the feds, well, they zeroed in on the tax evasion claims and were able to nail him on those more serious charges after the operation was taken apart during the bootlegging raids handled by Ness and his men. Those raids put the pressure on Capone and his crew. A few years later, Mayor Burton saw an opportunity to hire Ness and swooped in.
After his Chicago days, whether he was FBI or alcohol, firearms, or whatever at that point, but he was sent to Kentucky to bust stills. And he didn't particularly like that because he was facing all sorts of danger with nowhere near the publicity he was getting in Chicago. And so Burton offered him the job of safety director in Cleveland, which meant that he was head of not only the police department, but the fire department, any safety organization. I think Elliot Ness was smart enough to realize quite early on that this was something that was beyond his experience. And I think he deliberately kept hands off for about half of the duration of the case until the summer of '36. And then Burton, I think, went to him and said, look, you've got to get more involved.
And he did?
He did.
Yeah. How did he get more involved? Do you know?
Well, he called Peter Merlo in for a conference and said, well, you're on the case full time now. What have you discovered? And Merlo didn't like him very much and said, well, I've only been on the case a day or two. I'm just going over the records. I can't tell you anything.
Okay, so those two kind of came to the case at the same time after Burton had told Ness, and then Merlo. So the mayor, and you did mention that the mayor went to the police
Ness
chief,
and then went to the police chief. Yeah.
So these two kind of became a team, but Merlo wasn't real excited about being part of that team.
No, he was not. He did not like Elliot Ness.
I wonder why. Do you know why?
It's a little hard to say at this point. I think he may have considered Ness to be a grandstander of one sort or another. I'm sure he really objected to being called on the carpet after a day or two and being asked, well, what do you know so far?
So we are caught up to the summer of 1936 in the investigation of the Torso murders. Ness was ordered by the mayor to play a bigger role in the investigation, and it's just what he did. The Cleveland Police Department's lead detective, Peter Merlo, and Martin Zalewski were on the case full-time, and they were, despite a chippy relationship, all expected to get along to try and get this case solved. One problem: the bodies kept piling up. A teenage girl came upon the body of what was believed to have been a 40-year-old man, decapitated. He had been dead for quite some time, possibly 2 months, and this man had appeared to have been killed where he was found on the west side near Clinton Road. And it was around that time that Ness made a big move, an historic move, as he decided to get the investigative group as a whole together in one room.
In the summer of 1936, they held what they called the Torso Clinic. And Elliot Ness brought in Gerber, the other pathologists who had worked on the case, the police who had worked on it, and also brought the heads of the various mental institutions in. And as far as I can tell, this has got to be one of the very first examples of what we would recognize today as FBI profiling. And they came up with a reasonable profile of who they were dealing with. The problem was they were very reluctant to say, well, Jesus could be a doctor. Well, could be a hunter or could be a butcher. But they sort of shied away from the notion that it might be a doctor.
That was a mistake.
Oh, yes.
So the group had come up with a profile, but Dr. Badal believes that they had shied away from making it public knowledge that it may just be a doctor committing these gruesome murders. Why? Well, Dr. Badal simply believes it was because doctors had status in society. This thought that a doctor, of all people, may be the mad butcher would be hard for anyone to believe at this point. But Ness, of course, may not have released that information publicly, but there was little doubt he was still going to follow any lead he could, doctor or not. So now, in the summer of 1936, with the Torso Clinic wrapped up, Investigators believe the killer may be someone experienced with a knife, maybe a butcher, maybe a hunter, or even a doctor. So here's where we have to go back in time to 1934, when the killings first started, that an opportunity just may have passed, not due to poor police work, just due to circumstances that may have first led investigators to the thought process that it was actually a doctor in Cleveland who may actually be a mass murderer. And it may have led them to a doctor named Frank Sweeney. There was a medical facility near East 55th and Broadway, and next to the medical facility was a deli. A homeless man at that point named Emil Fronek was wandering around behind the deli. Interviews show, and Dr. Badal believes he wandered up the steps to an area that was a living quarters above that medical facility.
I think he blundered up there and ran into Frank Sweeney, who was there for whatever reason, who offered him, geez, would you like something to eat? And of course, he would love something to eat. And realized at some point that he was getting woozy and thought he may have been poisoned or drugged, and so ran out with the doctor chasing him. And Fronek ran down Broadway over to Jackass Hill and Kingsbury Run and hid out in a boxcar. Woke up 3 days later, and you can imagine what kind of shape he was in. He decided Cleveland is not for me. And so he headed off to Chicago. And it was a couple years later when his story reached the Cleveland police. Merlo went to Chicago to bring him back to Cleveland. Interviewed him, Ness interviewed him. The big mistake Fronek made was he told everybody that he talked to that the doctor's office was on the north side of the street. And I think he believed that because he remembered going in an entrance that did face the north, but it was a back entrance.
Okay.
Because they looked on the north side of the street and there was nothing there but shops and, regular offices. So they tended not to believe him that he had actually run into the Kingsbury Run murderer.
Now, according to records obtained by Dr. Badal, Dr. Francis Sweeney at that point had fallen on hard times. He was on the verge of a divorce and may have actually been spending considerable time, may have been living in those quarters above that medical center. There's more. Dr. Badal tells us Ness's right-hand man in the public safety office at the time was one David Cowles. Cowles has testified that Dr. Sweeney had privileges to use a funeral home to practice surgeries. That funeral home was on Meade Avenue, just a block away from the medical building and that deli. It could have been a huge break in the case, but Fronek was a homeless man who did not seem to, at that point, have his story straight. They, of course, at that moment did not know who exactly Fronek had run into at that medical building, but Dr. Badal believes it was Dr. Frank Sweeney. But there were other avenues, other reasons, according to Dr. Badal, that Ness and the detective started to become suspicious of Dr. Sweeney, some that may have pointed back to that interview with Fronek. And at some point, Ness decided to make it clear to Sweeney that they were watching him.
I did talk years ago with one of Elliot Ness's associates, and somehow they got a lead on Sweeney, whom at that time was a resident of the Soldiers and Sailors Home in Sandusky. And the man I talked to actually followed him around Cleveland. And Sweeney knew he was being followed. And at one point, he went into an all-black bar and ordered a drink and said, "One for my white shadow." At one point, Sweeney jumped on and off buses trying to confuse the man who was following him.
A police officer following him?
Wasn't a police officer. It was one of Ness's associates. They were called the Unknowns. And the unknown lost sight of him. Supposedly, Frank Sweeney called the police department and said, that man you had following me wasn't doing a very good job. If he wants to meet up with me, I'll be in the lobbies of Higbee's at such and such a time.
Sweeney, of course, never showed up. By 1938, two critical parts of the investigation were carried out. One, certainly, that did not turn out well for Elliot Ness. He had the shanty towns, all 6 of them in Kingsbury Run, burned to the ground. Remember, this was still the Depression, and many people were not working, and even those who were could not afford much. The shanty towns provided some cover for what were basically the city's homeless. But Ness believed, Dr. Badal said, that the victims were mostly people who lived in those shanty towns, and if those were cleaned up and out, the Mad Butcher would run out of victims and would subsequently be stopped. The press at the time turned on Elliot Ness for that decision. The other critical piece, at least to those who believed Dr. Frank Sweeney was indeed the Mad Butcher, was an off-the-books interview Ness and David Cowles did with Frank Sweeney that lasted over a week, Badal believes. Why was that interview done off the books? Why not arrest Sweeney at the time, read him his rights, and then interview him?
And I think something we have to remember is that Frank Sweeney's cousin was Martin L. Sweeney, the congressman from the 20th District. Relations between those two branches of the family didn't seem to be particularly close at that point, because Martin L. Sweeney seemed to have no notion that his cousin was on hard times. And again, I'm only guessing at this point. I don't think anyone in law enforcement would have ever protected anyone to protect the reputation of a politician. But Frank Sweeney was married. He had 2 children, and of course he had sisters. I think, and again, this is only supposition on my part, that Ness and company may have gone to Sweeney and said, look, we're going to get him off the street, and if you behave yourself politically, locally, we'll keep this under wraps. Not so much to protect him, but to protect Frank Sweeney's wife and kids and sister.
Badal also believes by this point that Sweeney was a schizophrenic. His wife had sued him for divorce in 1934, stating that he was an alcoholic, that he had clearly fallen on hard times. Ness, Badal said, had officers round up Sweeney, who at that point was living at the Soldiers and Sailors Home in Sandusky, and bring him to Cleveland. Ness wanted the interview kept secret, so Sweeney was brought to the Cleveland Hotel, which at the time was on Public Square.
Now, what Elliot Ness did was call in a marker from his Chicago days, and Leonard Keeler, the man who invented the modern-day polygraph, brought his machine to Cleveland in secret. I mean, this is really cloak and dagger stuff.
Right.
Conducted a lie detector test of Dr. Sweeney, supposedly then said to Ness, that's your man, I might as well throw my machine out the window if I say anything different. But they had no evidence.
But there is still one big question that needs to be answered. How do we know for sure that it was Dr. Frank Sweeney who was that man, the suspect, interviewed at the Cleveland Hotel? It was off the books. There are no official records of that interview. How is it then that a case that has never officially been solved has a suspect that so many people believe is the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run? You believe, Elliot Ness believes, that Dr. Sweeney is the man.
Yes. David Cowles was interviewed by, I think the woman was the first head of the Cleveland Police Historical Society, and a tape of this interview exists. And what Cowles said, and I produce the text of what he said in my book, is that we did have a suspect in this case. I'm not going to mention any names because his relative, his was a congressman, well, whoop-de-doo. And he was a doctor married to a nurse, etc., etc. I mean, he never mentions the name Sweeney, but he gives so many details that it's obviously who he's talking about.
Right. You believe that
yeah.
Dr. Sweeney is the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run?
I would say I'm 99.99% sure. Nothing I've ever found points away from him. Everything points to him.
Dr. Badal is not alone in his suspicions that Frank Sweeney is the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. But truth be told, the case has never been officially solved. And that makes developments in the last few weeks all the more intriguing. It was a 19 News exclusive. We reported that the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office is planning on exhuming the bodies of 3 of the unidentified victims of the notorious serial killer. The Medical Examiner's Office is working with the DNA Doe Project and hope to identify the victims that are buried in unmarked graves in a potter's field. The DNA Doe Project uses something called investigative genetic genealogy, a process that ultimately tries to find a common ancestor, something they hope will lead to identifying the victims. Dr. Thomas Gilson is the medical examiner of Cuyahoga County, and he said that the DNA Doe Project approached them. Let me ask you this. I'm sure you know people are going to be fascinated by this. Anytime people hear that there's bodies that are going to be exhumed in a cold case for whatever the reason, and you're talking about trying to identify these victims, this is going to grab the interest of a lot of people, especially because of the case, the torso killer. First of all, tell me you understand that, of course, and then can any of this lead back to the killer? Can you solve this crime by this, or is this simply a way to identify the victims? Or is there a path from identification of the victims to maybe saying with 100% certainty that Dr. Frank Sweeney was the torso killer?
You know what? It's an interesting question. I think the answer to both of those, questions is maybe. Can we identify who these folks are? Maybe. And if identifying them, does that help us find out who their, killer was? I'd say the answer to that is maybe, because if we kind of, I think it's one of the most basic things of any death investigation. Who's the person in front of me? And if it's kind of, I don't know, the spectrum of possibilities becomes a lot broader than, hey, there's funny business, I know who it is. Well, who did this person, have contact with? And if we can identify a couple of these folks, who did both of these people have contact with? Because we think it's that one person. So can we say for sure? No, we're just getting started. But, knowing who the victims are will probably be a good way to kickstart an investigation again, into who might have been responsible for this, because we don't really know for sure these, just the works of some random person. Maybe there was somebody who had an axe to grind with, 10 people and really, was off the rails crazy and killed a lot of people. So I'd say, the exhumation's going to be tricky though, because these are people, again, who are living on the periphery of society. They're buried in a potter's field. We're dealing with records that, are 90 years old. And, I think as much as people would like to think this is a very systematic, orderly process, it isn't.
And in a 90-year-old case, nobody should really expect a systemic, orderly process. But there does appear to be some real hope that maybe there can be some finality to this. We say some because there will never be a trial. And with so many unidentified victims, there really are no families out there looking for closure. The torso murders, the question of who was the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, has fascinated some Clevelanders and some around the country for decades. And now as the bodies of some of those victims are being taken from the earth, there will be new interest, new fascination with this case. For now, we will wait and see and wonder, did the break in the case come 90 years after the first murder? We thank Dr. James Badal, Maisie Adams of the Cleveland Police Historical Society, and Dr. Thomas Gilson of the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office. I'm Brian Duffy. Thank you for listening to Dark Side of the Land.
Subscribe now for future episodes and find more Dark Side of the Land and photo galleries related to these cases at cleveland19.com.